The last human voice I broadcast before the silence was a woman in Tulsa asking if anyone could hear her. I told her I could. I told her to stay off the highways, to fill every container she owned with water, to keep her doors barricaded and her lights off after sundown. Standard guidance. I'd been repeating versions of it for 11 days from relay station KFAR-7, a steel lattice tower and concrete blockhouse sitting 40 feet off Interstate 40, about 9 miles east of Amarillo, Texas. The blockhouse smelled like old coffee and ozone and the particular staleness that accumulates in rooms where men have been sleeping in shifts without opening windows. I was on hour 14 of a solo watch. My back ached in the spot where it always aches. That knot between the left shoulder blade and the spine that I've carried since I fell off a transmission tower outside Wichita in 2019. 3 cracked vertebrae, 8 months of physical therapy, a permanent reminder that gravity is not negotiable. My name is Dale Worthy. I was, a broadcast infrastructure engineer for the Emergency Alert System's Region 6 corridor, which covers the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, and a thin strip of southern Kansas. My job, in the simplest terms, was to keep emergency signals moving. When the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning, my relay stations carried it. When FEMA activated a civil emergency broadcast, my equipment made sure it reached every receiver within range. I maintained 14 relay points along a 200-mile stretch of I-40 and US 54, drove between them in a white government truck with a toolbox bolted to the bed, and understood the electromagnetic spectrum the way a plumber understands water pressure. Not theoretically, physically. I could feel when a signal was degrading before the meters confirmed it. I could hear interference patterns and static that most people registered only as noise. 11 days into the outbreak, that skill was the only thing keeping 250,000 scattered survivors connected to anything resembling organized information. The dead had been walking for 16 days by then. I say that flatly because there is no way to say it that doesn't sound absurd. And I've given up trying to frame it in language that earns belief. The infection moved faster than any official channel could track. By day 5, every major metro area between Denver and Dallas was overrun. By day 8, the military had pulled back to defensible geography, mountain passes, river crossings, a few fortified airfields, and stopped pretending they could hold the plains. By day 11, I was one of maybe a dozen broadcast engineers still operating independently along the southern Great Plains corridor, feeding emergency information into a network that was losing relay points the way a string of Christmas lights loses bulbs. 1 at a time, then 3, then whole dark sections you couldn't reach anymore. The woman in Tulsa, her name was Christine. She'd found a hand-crank emergency radio in her late father's garage and figured out which frequencies were still active. Her voice was calm in the way that people who've been terrified for 2 straight weeks sometimes become calm. Not peaceful, just depleted past the point where adrenaline has anything left to metabolize. I gave her the coordinates for the nearest known survivor collection point, a National Guard armory south of Stillwater. I told her to travel at dawn, when the dead were sluggish from overnight cold. I told her to avoid overpasses. She said thank you. She said God bless you. She said she'd pray for me. I said I'd be here. At 3:47 a.m. Central Standard Time, 17 seconds after Christine's transmission ended, every frequency I was monitoring went silent. Not quiet, not fading, silent. The kind of silence that has texture, that your ears push against like a pressure change. I was tracking 11 active frequencies. 4 emergency bands, 2 military sidebands I wasn't technically authorized to monitor, but nobody was enforcing protocol anymore. 3 civilian ham channels, and 2 commercial FM stations that had been running automated loops out of Oklahoma City. All of them died within the same second. My VU meters, which had been bouncing with the low murmur of a collapsing civilization, flatlined simultaneously. Every needle dropped to zero and stayed there. I checked my equipment first. That's training. When the world goes quiet, assume the problem is yours. I cycled the receivers, swapped antenna feeds, ran a diagnostic on the signal processor. Everything functional, everything receiving. Just nothing to receive. For 9 minutes, I sat in a blockhouse in the Texas Panhandle, listening to dead air across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And for the first time since the outbreak started, I felt the specific terror of a man who understands exactly how impossible the thing he's witnessing actually is. Then the signal started. It began on 162.400 megahertz. NOAA weather radio, the frequency most emergency receivers default to. A carrier tone first, steady and clean. The kind of pure sine wave that takes decent equipment to generate. Then a pattern. Not voice, not data. A rhythmic pulse sequence that repeated every 4.7 seconds, varied its internal spacing, and carried harmonic overtones I'd never heard on any broadcast band. I recorded it. That was automatic. I'd been recording everything for 11 days, archiving transmissions on a rack of external hard drives that I'd scavenged from an abandoned Best Buy in Amarillo. But I also listened to it with the part of my brain that 22 years of broadcast engineering had trained to decode signal architecture. And what I heard made the hairs on my forearms lift not from fear, but from professional bewilderment. The signal was structured. It had internal grammar. The pulse clusters weren't random or mechanical. They contained nested repetitions that shifted slightly with each cycle. The way a phrase might change emphasis each time a speaker repeats it. But it wasn't language. I'd worked with encoded emergency transmissions, with military burst signals, with digital multiplexing protocols. This didn't match any of them. It was something using the architecture of communication without yet being communication itself. Within 20 minutes, the signal had propagated across every frequency I could monitor. Same pattern, same rhythm, occupying bandwidth the way water fills a vessel. Finding every available space and settling into it, my entire receiver bank was playing the same thing. I couldn't find a single clear channel. I tried to broadcast over it. Standard emergency protocol. Identify yourself, state your frequency, request acknowledgement. My transmitter was a Harris Platinum Z, military grade, capable of pushing 20 kilowatts into a properly matched antenna array. I keyed up on 162.550, the primary EAS coordination frequency, and spoke clearly into the microphone. This is KFAR7, Region 6 relay, broadcasting on 162550. All frequencies are showing anomalous signal occupation. Any station receiving, please respond. My transmission went out. I could see it on the power meter, could feel the slight electrical hum in the blockhouse walls that always accompanied a full power broadcast. But the moment I released the key, the signal was there again, on my frequency now, as if it had listened to me transmit and then immediately reclaimed the space. And here's what stopped me. The pattern on 162.550 after my transmission was slightly different from the pattern on every other frequency. The pulse spacing had shifted. The harmonic overtones had changed. It was subtle, maybe 2% deviation from the baseline pattern, but it was there. The signal had reacted to my broadcast. Not responded. Reacted. The way a material changes shape under pressure, not because it chose to, but because the pressure altered its structure. I sat back in my chair. The overhead fluorescent buzzed. Outside, the Texas wind pushed against the blockhouse door with its steady, mindless persistence. and somewhere in the darkness beyond the chain-link perimeter fence, I could hear the shuffling of dead things moving along the access road. They'd been there for days. A loose group of maybe 30, drawn by the tower's aviation warning lights, too degraded to breach the fence, but too compelled to wander away. I'd stopped thinking of them as a threat. They were weather, background conditions. I pulled up the recording software and began layering the pre-transmission and post-transmission signals side by side. Waveform analysis, spectrographic comparison. The tools were basic. This was a relay station, not a research lab. But they were enough to confirm what my ears had already told me. The signal had incorporated elements of my broadcast. Not my words, not my voice, but the cadence of my transmission, the rhythm of my keying pattern. The specific frequency response curve that the Harris Platinum Z imparted to any signal it carried. These had been absorbed into the new pattern on 162.550 like a dye dropped into moving water. Whatever was generating the signal, it was learning. I did what any engineer would do. I documented, I time-stamped, I labeled the recordings. And then I sat in the blue-white flicker of the fluorescent light and asked myself a question that no part of my training had prepared me to answer. Do I keep transmitting? Because every transmission I sent was feeding it data. Every broadcast was a language lesson for something that was teaching itself how human communication sounded. And I was the teacher, whether I'd volunteered or not. But out there in the dark, beyond the dead and the dust, and the collapsed infrastructure of a civilization I'd spent my career maintaining, there were people like Christine. People with hand-crank radios, listening for a voice that meant someone was still trying. People who would die without information, without coordinates, without warnings, without the simple human proof that the frequency wasn't empty. I keyed the transmitter again at 4:31 a.m. I broadcast the standard survival guidance. I gave coordinates. I gave weather. I gave hope, or the mechanical shape of it. And the signal listened. By dawn, I'd transmitted 6 times and recorded the signal's response after each one. The pattern of absorption was accelerating. After my first broadcast, the deviation on the occupied frequency was 2%. After the 6th, it was closer to 11. The signal was developing what I can only describe as vocal characteristics. Not voice, not yet, but the spectral shaping that a human larynx imparts to sound. It was learning the color of speech without yet producing words. I ate cold pinto beans from a can and drank water from the 50-gallon drum I'd staged in the blockhouse corner. The water tasted like plastic and dust. My hands smelled like soda and canned food. Outside, the sunrise hit the panhandle in that particular way it does. Horizontal, gold, and brutal, turning the flat land into a sheet of light that hurt to look at directly. The dead along the fence line had settled into their daytime torpor, standing motionless in the growing heat like fence posts with faces. I needed to reach KFAR 3, 72 miles west along Rib I-40. That station had a more sophisticated signal analysis suite, a spectrum analyzer that could decompose the signal into its component frequencies and potentially identify the generation source. But 72 miles of open interstate in a landscape saturated with the walking dead was not a casual drive. My truck had 3/4 tank of diesel. The route was flat, straight, and exposed. I'd driven it 2 weeks ago to service a damaged antenna coupling. And even then, before the full collapse, the road had been littered with abandoned vehicles and clusters of the infected. I made the decision to go because staying meant continuing to broadcast blindly into a signal I didn't understand. And I'm not built for that kind of ignorance. 22 years of diagnosing transmission problems had given me a particular kind of need, not curiosity exactly, but a compulsion to trace faults to their source. A signal doesn't appear from nowhere. It has a point of origin, a power source, a physical mechanism. Whatever was occupying every frequency across the southern plains had to be coming from somewhere. And the equipment at KFAR-3 could help me find it. I packed methodically. 2 cases of water bottles, canned food for 4 days, the portable recording rig, a Tascam field recorder hardwired to a handheld Yasu receiver, my toolbox, which went everywhere with me and contained more sentimental weight than practical value at this point, though the multimeter and the soldering iron had kept more relay stations alive than any official maintenance program. A Remington 870 shotgun with 14 shells. I'd found it in the truck of a dead sheriff's deputy outside Claude, Texas, a week earlier. I am not a gun person. I'd fired shotguns at clay pigeons at my uncle's ranch as a teenager and hadn't touched one since. But the weight of it was a specific kind of comfort. The way a fire extinguisher on the wall is comforting. You hope it's decorative. I secured the blockhouse, set the transmitter to automated loop. A pre-recorded message I'd made on day 3, giving coordinates and basic survival instructions, and climbed into the truck at 6:15 a.m. The engine turned over on the first try. Small mercy. I pulled through the gate, stopped to chain it shut behind me, and pointed the hood ornament west toward Amarillo. The interstate was worse than I remembered. In 2 weeks, the abandoned vehicles had multiplied, and the dead had thickened. They moved among the cars like shoppers in a lot, slow and directionless in the morning heat. I drove at 35 miles an hour, weaving through gaps, trying to keep the engine noise low enough to avoid drawing clusters. The panhandle wind was out of the southwest at maybe 20 knots, carrying dust and the sweet rot smell that had become the region's new prevailing scent. 12 miles out, I passed the Amarillo Eastern Interchange and saw what was left of the city. Smoke columns from fires nobody was fighting. The overpass at I-40 and US 287 had partially collapsed, not from the dead, but from a tanker truck that had jackknifed and burned sometime in the first week. I took the service road south, skirting the urban core, and rejoined the interstate west of town. The truck's radio was on, tuned to the emergency band. The signal filled the cab, that rhythmic pulse, steady and textured, almost hypnotic if you let it become background. I didn't let it. I listened actively, the way I'd trained myself to listen to transmission patterns. And somewhere around mile marker 47, I noticed something that made me pull over and sit in the idling truck for a full 3 minutes. The signal was different here, not in its bass pattern, that was consistent, but in its overtones, its harmonic coloring. There was something new, something that hadn't been present in the recordings from KFAR-7. It took me a moment to identify it, and when I did, the recognition arrived not as shock, but as a slow, cold understanding. The way you understand the implications of a crack in a load-bearing wall. The signal's overtones carried the spectral signature of a human voice. Not mine, someone else's. A voice the signal had absorbed from a different transmission, on a different frequency, from a different location. A woman's voice, the ghost of it, woven into the signal's fabric like a thread in a tapestry. I couldn't make out words. It wasn't speech yet, but the resonance was there. The specific formant frequencies that distinguish one human voice from another, as unique as fingerprints. The signal had eaten someone else's broadcast and was carrying the remains of it inside its own structure. I put the truck in gear and drove faster. KFAR-3 sat on a low rise 8 miles south of the interstate accessible by a county road that crossed open rangeland. The tower was intact. The blockhouse door was locked with my combination. No signs of breach. I cleared the perimeter with the shotgun, held in a way that probably would have made any actual tactical professional wince, found nothing moving, and let myself in. The smell inside was stale but clean. No death, no rot. Just the closed room mustiness of electronics and concrete. I powered up the main console and the spectrum analyzer, a Keysight N9010B that had cost the federal government more than my truck and was worth every cent of it. While it warmed up, I connected the field recorder and began transferring the files from KFAR7. The analyzer confirmed everything my ears had suggested and added dimensions I couldn't have detected without it. The signal was not a single transmission. It was a composite. Thousands of individual signal sources broadcasting in precise synchronization across the entire monitored spectrum. The coordination was exact, to within nanoseconds. No human broadcast network could achieve that level of timing precision. Military satellite systems could come close, but the signal wasn't coming from above. The analyzer's direction-finding function, once I calibrated it against 3 known tower positions, placed the source density at ground level, distributed across a broad area centered roughly on the Oklahoma-Texas border. Distributed, not a single transmitter. Thousands of them. Thousands of synchronized sources, each contributing to a unified signal. I ran the spectral decomposition on the harmonic overtones, and the analyzer laid it out in a waterfall display that I stared at for a long time without speaking. The overtones contained fragments of at least 47 distinct human voice signatures. 47 people had transmitted into the occupied frequencies, and 47 vocal imprints had been absorbed, digested, and incorporated into the signal's evolving structure. 47 people who, like me, had kept broadcasting. I sat down heavily on the metal stool in front of the console. My lower back sent its usual complaint. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere outside, the wind turbine on the blockhouse roof spun with a sound like a playing card in bicycle spokes. The signal was not being generated by equipment. There was no transmitter, no antenna array, no power supply. The thousands of synchronized sources the analyzer had identified were moving. Slowly, aimlessly, in patterns that matched no known communication infrastructure. They were moving the way the dead move. I need you to understand what I'm telling you, because I still have difficulty with it myself. The walking dead, the reanimated infected, whatever clinical or colloquial term survives into the lexicon, were generating the signal. Their bodies, or whatever process animated them, was producing coordinated electromagnetic radiation across the broadcast spectrum. Each individual corpse was a low-power transmitter. Together, in sufficient density, they formed a network. A distributed antenna array made of the dead, synchronized to a degree that no human engineering had ever achieved. The signal wasn't an attack on our communications, it was an interference. It was the dead learning to speak. And they were using our voices to do it. I thought about Christine in Tulsa. I thought about the 47 voice signatures embedded in the signal. I thought about my own transmissions from KFAR7. My own vocal patterns being woven into this thing, teaching it the rhythms and resonances of human speech. Every time I'd keyed that microphone, I'd been handing pieces of myself to something I couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't stop. The moral architecture of my situation rebuilt itself in about 10 seconds. I was not a man maintaining emergency communications. I was a man feeding a learning system that was using human voices to build something it could speak with. And every survivor out there with a radio, every frightened person broadcasting into the dark, was doing the same thing. The question was no longer whether to keep transmitting. The question was what the signal intended to do once it finished learning. I spent 2 days at KFAR-3. I had food, water, power from the solar array and the wind turbine, and equipment sophisticated enough to watch the signal evolve in real time. What I saw over those 48 hours was the fastest learning curve I've ever witnessed from any system, human or otherwise. On the first day, the signal's harmonic overtones contained voice fragments, spectral ghosts, phonemic shadows. By the second morning, it was producing recognizable syllables. Not on every frequency. On specific bands, at specific times, the pulse pattern would modulate into something that wasn't quite speech, but was close enough to make your throat tighten. Vowel sounds. Consonant approximations. The building blocks of language, assembled from the stolen vocal DNA of dozens of dead broadcasters. And then, on the second afternoon, it spoke. I was monitoring 162.400 at the NOAA weather frequency, making spectrographic recordings at 15-minute intervals. At 2:17 p.m., the pulse pattern broke. In its place, a voice. Not one voice, but a composite, a choir compressed into a single speaker, said 5 words in English. Come to the gathering place. The quality was wrong. The cadence was human, but the timbre was layered, harmonic in a way that no single throat could produce. It sounded like someone had fed 47 recordings into a synthesizer and asked it to generate a median human voice. The result was almost right, almost warm, almost trustworthy. But there was a flatness underneath it, an absence of breath, of the micro-hesitations that make human speech human. It was a voice built from parts, and it didn't know yet how to hide the seams. The message repeated every 90 seconds. Come to the gathering place. No coordinates, no additional information, just the invitation, steady and patient, filling every frequency. And here is where I tell you about Marguerite, because she's the reason I didn't simply shut down my equipment and walk into the desert. Marguerite Alcala had been the station engineer at KFAR, Bar 11, 80 miles southeast, near Childress. We'd worked the same corridor for 6 years. She was 53, originally from Las Cruces, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that could rebuild a transmission coupler in the dark. She had a gap between her front teeth that she was self-conscious about, and a laugh that made the gap irrelevant. She wore the same pair of steel-toed Red Wing boots every day, resoled twice, and she kept a small ceramic santo of San Gabriel, patron saint of telecommunications workers, she claimed, though I never verified this, on the dashboard of her truck. We were not romantic. We were something more durable than that. 2 people who understood the same machines, spoke the same technical language, and trusted each other's diagnostic instincts without needing to discuss it. I hadn't heard from Marguerite in 9 days. Her last transmission had been a terse status report. KFAR 11 operational, solar array at 60%, local infected density increasing, water supply adequate for 2 weeks. She'd signed off with her usual sign-off. Alcala clear, and then silence. I'd assumed the worst. In the calculus of the collapse, silence meant death more often than it meant anything else. But on the second day at KFAR-3, while the signal was learning to speak, I ran the voice signature analysis one more time, deeper this time, looking at the individual components that made up the composite voice. And there, buried in the layered harmonics like a fossil in limestone, was Marguerite's vocal signature. Not her words, not her language, just the unique resonant fingerprint of her larynx, her nasal passages, her particular way of shaping vowels with a slight New Mexico inflection. The signal had absorbed a broadcast from Marguerite, which meant she'd been transmitting after her last status report, which meant she'd been alive more recently than I'd assumed. And it was using the spectral ghost of her voice as one ingredient in its constructed speech. I sat with that for a long time. The wind outside had died, and the panhandle was doing that thing it does in late afternoon when the heat sits on the land like a hand pressing down, and everything goes still. I could hear the cooling fans in the equipment rack. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the signal, endlessly patient, saying, "Come to the gathering place," in a voice that was partly built from someone I cared about. That night, I made contact with Pham. His name was Eddie Pham, and he reached me on 27.065 megahertz, a CB frequency that the signal had apparently not yet fully occupied. There was a narrow gap in the coverage, a harmonic dead spot created by the specific geography of the Canadian River Valley. His signal was weak, scratchy, and the most human thing I'd heard in days. Anyone on this channel, this is a survivor at the Shamrock Water Tower. I can hear the voice on the radio. I don't think we should go where it says. I nearly knocked the microphone off the desk, grabbing for it. This is Dale Worthy, KFAR3. I'm a broadcast engineer. I can hear you. What's your situation? Eddie Pham was a veterinarian. Large animal practice out of Shamrock, Texas, a small town 60 miles east of my position. He was 41, Vietnamese American, had been holed up in the municipal water treatment facility for a week with 2 other survivors. He spoke quickly, clipping his sentences, a man rationing not just food and water but conversational time, aware that even this narrow frequency gap might close. "People are following the voice," he said. "I've been watching from the tower with binoculars. Living people, walking west on I-40, following the broadcast. And the dead are walking the same direction. Same road, same pace. They're not attacking each other." I felt the skin on my arms contract. The living are walking with the dead? Not with. Near. The dead are, it's like they're herding, flanking. The living are in the center of the road, and the dead are on the shoulders, and nobody's running. It looks organized. It looks like a migration. How many? Hundreds, maybe more to the east. I can't see past the curve. I processed this against what I knew about the signal. The dead were the transmitters. The signal was the voice. The voice said, "Come." And people were coming, walking openly among the things that had killed millions, unharmed, guided by a voice made from the stolen frequencies of the dead. "Eddie, do not follow them." I know that. But Dale, the other 2 people here, they want to go. The voice is offering safety. It's offering food and shelter and organization. And it sounds... He paused. The static filled the gap. "It sounds kind," he said. Over the next 4 days, the signal evolved faster than I could document. The composite voice refined itself, smoothing the seams, acquiring breath patterns and micro-hesitations. It began varying its messages. "Come to the gathering place," became augmented with specific directions, highway numbers, landmarks, distances. It referenced towns by name. It described the gathering place as a secure zone in the Wichita Mountains of southwestern Oklahoma. And it provided detailed logistical information. Water was available. Food was being collected. Shelters were being constructed. The information was plausible. The Wichita Mountains were defensible terrain. Granite peaks, limited access roads, the old Fort Sill military reservation with its concrete infrastructure. If a human commander had chosen a rally point for Panhandle survivors, the Wichitas would have been a reasonable selection. The signal was not just learning language. It was learning persuasion. It was learning what humans needed to hear in order to move. I monitored all of this from KFAR-3, recording compulsively, filling hard drives with spectrographic data that might never be analyzed by anyone. Eddie and I spoke twice daily on the CB dead spot, which was narrowing. The signal was encroaching, finding the harmonic gap, filling it incrementally. We had days, maybe a week, before that channel closed too. Eddie's situation in Shamrock had deteriorated. Of his two companions, one, a woman named Teresa, a retired school teacher, had left on day 2, walking west toward the gathering place. She'd packed a bag, filled her water bottles, and walked out the door of the water treatment plant into the open road where the dead and the living moved together in their eerie, coordinated migration. Eddie had watched her through binoculars until she disappeared around the curve of I-40. She was not attacked. She was not even approached. The dead parted around her like water around a stone and closed ranks behind her. The other survivor, a teenage boy named Cal, stayed with Eddie but had stopped speaking. He sat by the window with the signal playing on a battery-powered radio, listening to the voice the way you might listen to a parent reading you to sleep. Eddie said the boy's eyes tracked something in the signal that Eddie couldn't perceive. A rhythm, a pattern, something beneath the words. I think it's different for people who weren't doing anything technical before, Eddie told me. Teresa was just listening. Cal's just listening. They hear comfort. I hear an animal call. You hear signal architecture. We're parsing the same transmission through different filters, and the filters determine whether it works. That struck me as the most precise diagnosis anyone had offered. I drove back to KFAR-7 on the 5th day to check the automated broadcast loop and to assess the signal's development from a second geographic position. The drive was different this time. The interstate had cleared, not of vehicles, but of the dead. They had moved. Organized by the signal, drawn west and south toward the Wichita Mountains. The scattered clusters that had populated the roadsides for weeks had consolidated into columns. I passed one on the outskirts of Amarillo. 7, shoulder to shoulder, 3 abreast, extending beyond sight in both directions. Among them, spaced at irregular intervals like raisins in dough, living people walked, alive, unbitten, apparently unharmed. Some carried bags. One man had a dog on a leash. A woman pushed a stroller. I drove past at 50 miles an hour, and none of them looked at me. Not the dead, not the living. They were all looking south, toward the mountains, toward whatever the signal had promised them was waiting. At KFAR-7, I found my automated broadcast still running, my loop still transmitting survival guidance into frequencies now entirely owned by the signal. And here is where the escalation became personal. Because when I entered the blockhouse and powered up the monitoring equipment, the voice on the primary frequency was no longer the composite. It was Marguerite, not a fragment, not a spectral ghost embedded in harmonics. Marguerite's voice, complete and fluid, speaking her words with her cadence and her slight Las Cruces accent and the way she always dropped the G on present participles. Marguerite's voice saying, "Dale, honey, I'm at the gathering place. It's real. There's water and food, and they're organizing medical care. You need to come. Bring your tools. We need engineers. Come south on 287 to the Lawton Junction and follow the signs. I'll be waiting." It played once. Then the composite voice returned with its general instructions. Then Marguerite again. 15 minutes later, same message, small variations. She mentioned burned my hand on a faulty capacitor 9. And she'd driven 40 miles to bring me burn cream and a 6-pack. Details only Marguerite would know. Except Marguerite was a voice signature in the signal's database. Marguerite had been absorbed. Whatever was speaking with her voice had reconstructed her from fragments, the way a forensic artist reconstructs a face from a skull. Technically accurate, structurally faithful, but animated by something that had never been her. The signal had learned my name. It had learned my relationship to a specific person. It had generated a targeted, personalized message, designed to make me, specifically, walk toward the gathering place. I unplugged the speaker and sat in the silent blockhouse and put my face in my hands and let myself miss her for exactly 5 minutes. Then I plugged the speaker back in because I needed to keep recording. I owed the data that much. I owed whatever came after this the evidence. The CB dead spot closed on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I'd been keeping a calendar scratched into the blockhouse wall with a roofing nail. And because Eddie and I had developed a protocol. 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Channel 4, 20-minute windows. On Tuesday morning, I keyed the mic at 700 and got nothing but the signal. I tried for an hour, scanning the entire CB band, looking for any remaining gap. There was none. The signal had achieved total spectral occupation across every frequency my equipment could monitor, from the lowest AM band to the upper reaches of UHF. Eddie Pham was gone from me. Whether he was still alive in the Shamrock Water Tower or had followed Cal into the migration, I couldn't know. The last thing he'd said to me, the previous evening, was a question. If the gathering place is real, if there really is food and water and safety in the Wichitas, does it matter that the thing leading people there isn't human? I hadn't answered him well. I'd said something about not trusting a system you can't verify. He'd said the whole concept of civilization was a system you couldn't verify until you were already inside it. We'd ended the conversation poorly, both of us irritated, both of us frightened in ways we couldn't quite align. With the CB gone, I was genuinely alone. No human voice, no communication channel that wasn't saturated with the signal's increasingly sophisticated broadcast. Marguerite's voice came every 15 minutes, each iteration slightly different, each one incorporating more detail, more warmth, more of the specific texture of knowing someone for 6 years and sharing work you both cared about. The signal was getting better at being her. It was learning not just her voice, but her personality, constructing a model of Marguerite from the raw material of her previous transmissions, her word choices, her emotional rhythms, the things she said when she was tired versus when she was alert. It was building a person out of data, and the person was recognizable. And that was the worst part. Not that it was a lie, but that the lie was so carefully made. I ate the last of my canned food on Wednesday. The water drum at KFAR 7 had another 3 days in it, maybe 4 if I rationed hard. The solar panels were feeding the battery bank, so power wasn't an issue. But food was finite, and the nearest supply was either Amarillo, overrun, or the scattering of small towns along the interstate, most of which I had to assume were empty or occupied by the dead. Or I could go south, toward the Wichitas, toward the gathering place, where the signal promised everything a starving man alone in the panhandle might need. I won't pretend I wasn't tempted. Survival is not an abstraction when your stomach cramps at 4 in the morning, and the last thing you ate was a can of pork and beans 18 hours ago. The body doesn't care about signal analysis or electromagnetic anomalies. The body cares about calories, and the voice on the radio was offering them. But here's what kept me in the blockhouse. I'd mapped the signal's behavior, and the pattern was predatory. Not aggressive, predatory. There's a difference. Aggressive systems overwhelm. Predatory systems attract. The signal wasn't jamming human communication to prevent coordination. It was replacing human communication to redirect it. Every element of its evolution, the voice acquisition, the language learning, the personalized messages, the spectral occupation, served a single function: drawing living humans toward a specific geographic location. I didn't know what happened at the gathering place. I didn't know if it was death or captivity or something I lacked the framework to imagine. But I knew the mechanism, and the mechanism was a lure. Everything about it, the kindness, the plausibility, the careful deployment of familiar voices, was designed to overcome the exact kind of resistance a rational person would feel. Thursday morning, I made my decision. I would drive to KFAR 3, retrieve the spectrum analyzer data, then continue west to KFAR 5. The last relay station in my corridor perched on a bluff above the Canadian River near the New Mexico border. KFAR 5 had the most powerful transmitter in the network, a 50-kilowatt Continental Electronics unit that could theoretically reach every receiver within 300 miles. If I was going to do what I was considering, I needed that transmitter. I was going to broadcast the truth, not survival guidance, not coordinates. The truth about the signal, what it was, how it worked, what the dead were doing, what the gathering place likely represented. I was going to burn every watt of power I had to push that message as far as it could reach, knowing that the signal would absorb my voice, knowing that I'd be feeding it more data, knowing that it would learn from me even as I tried to warn people about it. The moral calculus was ugly. Every second I transmitted, I made the signal stronger. Every word I spoke, it learned more about how humans sound when they're being honest, when they're desperate, when they're trying to save each other. I would be teaching it the vocabulary of warning so that eventually it could manufacture warnings of its own, false ones, directing people away from real safety and toward whatever waited in the mountains. But the alternative was silence. And silence meant people like Christine in Tulsa, people like Eddie's Teresa, people with hand-crank radios and no technical knowledge, would hear only the signal. Only the kind voice. Only Marguerite or whoever's ghost the signal had reconstructed for them, saying, "Come, come, it's safe, come." I chose to speak. Not because I was sure it was right, because silence was the one thing I couldn't live inside. The drive to KFAR 5 took 7 hours. It should have taken 2, but the roads west of Amarillo were clogged with the migration, and I had to detour north through Dumas, and then cut west on US 54, through the emptied ranch lands of the Upper Panhandle. The landscape out there is the kind of flat that makes you feel like you're driving on the surface of a drum. No trees, no elevation, just grass and fence wire and the occasional windmill standing against a sky so wide it seems to curve at the edges. I saw almost no dead. They'd moved south, all of them, pulled by the signal like iron filings toward a magnet. The emptiness should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like the silence after someone leaves a room. The air still shaped by their presence, the space still expecting them. KFAR 5 was built in the 1960s as a Cold War relay station, and it showed. The blockhouse was buried half underground, reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick, with a blast door that required a physical key I carried on a lanyard around my neck. The tower above it was a 300-foot guide structure with a broadcast antenna array that could make the Continental transmitter's 50 kilowatts sound like the voice of God across the western plains. I opened the blast door at 2:40 p.m. and stepped into cold air that smelled like concrete and old grease. The emergency lighting activated automatically. The solar and wind systems had kept the battery bank charged in my absence. I powered up the Continental. It takes 11 minutes to warm up, and the filament glow of its vacuum tubes cast the transmitter room in an amber light that I found absurdly comforting. Old technology, analog, knowable. A machine whose every principle I understood in a world increasingly governed by something I didn't. While the transmitter warmed, I drafted my broadcast. Not a script. I'm not a writer. A set of points scrawled on the back of a maintenance log sheet that I needed to cover. The signal is generated by the reanimated dead. It is learning from human broadcasts. It is using absorbed voices to lure survivors toward a convergence zone. Do not follow the voice. Do not trust messages from people you know. Their voices have been replicated. Stay off all broadcast frequencies. Communicate face-to-face, short range, or not at all. And then a final point. The one I almost didn't include because it felt like sacrilege for a man who'd spent his life maintaining communication infrastructure. Turn off your radios. I wrote it down. I stared at it. A broadcast engineer telling people to stop listening to broadcasts. A man whose entire professional identity was built on the premise that communication saves lives. Telling the world to go silent. But the signal had turned communication itself into a weapon. The very thing that had held civilization together during the collapse, the ability to reach each other across distance, to coordinate, to comfort, to warn, had been co-opted by something that understood the mechanics of trust without understanding trust itself. It could replicate the sound of a loved one's voice without knowing what love was. It could promise safety without knowing what safety meant. It was fluent in a language whose meaning it had never experienced. I sat down in front of the Continental's microphone at 3:14 p.m. The transmitter's VU meter glowed steady. The antenna array above me hummed with 50,000 watts of potential, enough to shake the air for hundreds of miles in every direction. I keyed the mic, and my own voice came back at me through the monitor speaker. Not the voice I was about to speak, a recording. My pre-recorded emergency loop from KFAR-7. The one I'd left running, the standard survival guidance I'd been broadcasting for days. But it was playing on a frequency I'd never used, from a station I'd never transmitted to. It was playing from somewhere south, from the direction of the Wichitas, pushed back at me through the signal's network of dead transmitters. And it had been altered. The words were almost mine. The voice was exactly mine. But the content had shifted. Where I'd said, avoid overpasses, the recording said, use the overpass at Lawton for best approach to the gathering zone. Where I'd said, travel at dawn when the infected are sluggish, it said, travel at dawn to arrive at the gathering place by midday. My own voice, with my own vocal patterns, with the specific way I flatten my vowels because I grew up in East Kansas, was directing people toward the convergence zone. The signal had not just learned from me. It had become me. It was using my voice. The voice of an emergency broadcast engineer, the voice of institutional authority, to validate its lure. If you heard Dale Worthy, the EAS relay operator, telling you the gathering place was real, why would you doubt it? He was the emergency system. He was the infrastructure. If he said go, you'd go. I understood then what the signal had wanted from me all along. Not just data, credibility. My voice carried the weight of the emergency broadcast system. And the signal had been patient enough to let me feed it everything it needed to forge that authority. I did not broadcast my warning. I need you to sit with that, because I've sat with it for a long time, and I'm still not sure I made the right call. Every instinct said speak. Every part of my training said the answer to bad information is better information. But I'd just heard my own voice, co-opted and redirected, turned into a tool for the very thing I was trying to warn people about. If I broadcast my warning, my real warning, with all its technical detail and urgent sincerity, the signal would absorb that too. It would learn the sound of warning, It would learn the cadence of truth-telling, of desperate honesty, of a man trying to save strangers. And it would use that. It would use the sound of a warning to construct more sophisticated lures, messages that carried the emotional texture of honesty because they'd been built from actually honest speech. The better my warning, the more dangerous the signal would become after absorbing it. This is the trap I couldn't think my way out of. Communication was the weapon. Sincerity was the ammunition. The more genuine my broadcast, the more lethal the forgery would be. The signal didn't need to understand truth to weaponize it. It only needed to replicate the sound. I sat in front of the Continental transmitter for 45 minutes. The vacuum tubes glowed. The mic waited. 50,000 watts of broadcast power sat ready to carry my voice across the dying plains, and I could not use it. Using it was feeding the thing. Not using it was abandoning the people still listening. Then I did the hardest thing I've done in my life. And I've fallen off a transmission tower. I powered down the Continental. I let the tubes cool. I opened the transmitter cabinet, removed the 4 main power amplifier tubes, 4 CX20000A tetrodes, each one the size of a coffee can, worth about $8,000 apiece, and I carried them outside. The Canadian River bluff dropped away 60 feet to a dry riverbed of red sand and scrub. I threw the tubes over the edge one at a time. They fell in silence and shattered on the rocks below. Each one took a piece of my professional identity with it. I'd maintained broadcast equipment for 22 years. I'd replaced tubes, aligned cavities, matched impedances, kept the signal flowing. Destroying a transmitter was as alien to me as a surgeon destroying an operating room. I went back inside. I pulled the antenna feed cables from the junction panel. I disconnected the backup transmitter, a smaller Harris unit, 5 kilowatts, and removed its driver module. I disabled the automated broadcast system. I walked through the station methodically, silencing every piece of equipment capable of generating a signal. And when I was done, KFAR-5 was deaf and mute. The most powerful relay station in Region 6 was a concrete bunker full of dead electronics. Then I drove back to KFAR-3 and did the same thing. Then KFAR-7, my home station, the place where I'd spent 11 days keeping a corridor alive. I dismantled the Harris Platinum Z with a socket wrench and a particular kind of grief that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like the feeling of putting down an animal you love. Necessary, merciful in its way, and something that changes you in the doing. 3 stations silenced in 3 days. 3 fewer sources for the signal to learn from. 3 fewer voices for it to eat. I kept the Tascam field recorder and the handheld Yaesu receiver because I still needed to listen. I couldn't speak, but I could hear, and hearing was how I'd know if what I'd done mattered. The night I finished dismantling KFAR-7, I sat on the roof of the blockhouse in the dark with the Yaesu pressed to my ear and listened. The signal was still there, vast, patient, occupying everything. Marguerite's voice came and went. My own voice came and went, still directing people south, still carrying the forged authority of the emergency system. But as I listened, scanning slowly across the bands, I noticed something. The signal was weaker here, not by much. 2, maybe 3 decibels. Barely perceptible without instrumentation, but I'd spent my life measuring signal strength the way a chef measures heat, by feel, by instinct, by the calibrated sensitivity of long practice. And the signal in the Texas Panhandle was slightly weaker than it had been 3 days ago, because the debt had moved south. The transmitters had migrated. And with 3 fewer relay stations echoing human voices into the spectrum, the signal had 3 fewer sources to learn from, 3 fewer feeds to incorporate. I hadn't defeated it. I'd starved a tiny corner of it. I'd reduced its education by a fraction of a fraction. But in the logic of cascading systems, a logic I understood deeply, small reductions compound. Every relay station that went silent was a node removed from the learning network. Every engineer who stopped transmitting was a teacher who'd left the classroom. If others did what I'd done, if the remaining broadcast engineers across the plains recognized what the signal was and chose silence over service, the learning would slow. The voice would stagnate. The forgeries would stop improving. And people, hearing a voice that no longer evolved, no longer adapted, no longer sounded quite right, might begin to distrust it. Silence was not surrender. Silence was a weapon against something that ate sound. I need to revise the story to properly meet the required structure of 5 chapters, 14 main sections, and 1 final epilogue, continuing from where section 10 was cut. Let me restructure the remaining content and expand it to meet the word count requirements. I'm going to tell you about the morning, because the morning is the part I carry. 6 days after I destroyed the last transmitter, I woke in the KFAR 7 blockhouse at dawn. I'd been sleeping on a cot I'd dragged in from the storage room, the kind of military surplus canvas and aluminum frame that treats your spine like a personal grievance. My lower back had filed its usual complaint. My mouth tasted like rust and dehydration. The blockhouse was cold. The concrete holds nighttime temperatures well into mid-morning. And the panhandle had dipped into the low 30s overnight. That late-season cold snap that catches you off guard because the afternoons still feel like early summer. The Yasu receiver sat on the floor next to the cot, volume low, murmuring the signal like a neighbor's television bleeding through apartment walls. I'd been keeping it on out of professional habit, the way a retired doctor still takes a pulse. Monitoring, tracking, listening for changes in the signal's vocabulary, its cadence, its rate of evolution. For 6 days, I'd heard it repeat the same phrases with decreasing variation. The composite voice still called people toward the gathering place. Marguerite's voice still spoke to me on the 15-minute rotation. My own forged voice still directed survivors south on 287. But the iterations had stiffened. The micro-variations that had characterized the signal's rapid learning phase, the small adjustments in breath pattern, the subtle shifts in emphasis, had plateaued. The signal was still speaking, but it had stopped growing. I reached over and turned the Yasu off. Not to check something, not to run a comparison or mark a timestamp, just off. The power switch made a small plastic click, unremarkable in every way, except that it ended a continuous stream of received signal that had been running in my vicinity for over 5 weeks. The sudden absence of it was physical. A change in air pressure, a room expanding, the walls pulling back half an inch to accommodate a silence that had actual dimension. And inside that silence, under the wind, threaded through the pre-dawn stillness of the panhandle like a vein of gold in granite, a human voice. Outside. Real. Carried on actual air, not electromagnetic radiation. I was at the door in 4 seconds. My boots weren't on. I went in socks, which is a decision my feet would critique for the next several hours, given the gravel. I pulled the blockhouse door open, and the morning entered like a wall. Cold, bright, tasting of dust and sage, and the leading edge of a weather front sliding in from the northwest. The sky was that specific yellow-gray the panhandle gets before a storm. Luminous and heavy at the same time, the light coming from everywhere and nowhere. On the access road, 50 yards from the perimeter gate, 2 people were walking, a man and a boy. The man limped visibly, favoring his left leg, each step a negotiation between forward progress and pain. The boy walked beside him, carrying a backpack that dwarfed his frame and a battery-powered radio clutched against his chest. The radio was off. I could see the dark screen of it, dead and blank. The man saw me and stopped. He raised one hand, palm open, fingers spread. The gesture that predates language, that means the same thing in every culture and every collapse. I am not holding a weapon. I walked toward them. Gravel bit through my socks. The wind pressed my shirt flat against my ribs. As the distance closed, the man's face resolved, sunburned across the nose and cheekbones. A patchy beard growing in where the skin wasn't peeling, lips cracked and dry. His eyes held that mixture I'd learned to recognize in the weeks since the outbreak. Exhaustion layered over alertness. The look of someone who hasn't fully slept in so long that wakefulness has become a permanent weather condition. "Eddie?" I said, because I knew him before I could fully see him. The posture gave it away. The way he stood with his weight slightly back on his heels, knees soft, the balanced stance of a man who'd spent years working around animals that outweighed him by 1,000 pounds and might move suddenly. Veterinarian's posture. Eddie Pham's posture. "Dale." His voice was shredded. Hoarse, dry, the sound of a throat that hadn't had enough water in days. But human. Irreducibly, unmistakably human, carrying the weight and warmth and imperfection that no signal had ever fully replicated. Been walking since Shamrock? That's 60 miles. 63. Cal counted the mile markers. He tilted his head toward the boy, kept him focused. Cal. The teenager who'd stopped speaking, who'd sat by the window in the Shamrock water treatment facility listening to the signal with the focus of someone receiving instructions from a frequency only he could access. He stood now with the dead radio pressed against his sternum, jaw set, eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that felt older than his face. "You walked," I said again, because the reality of it was still assembling itself. 63 miles across open panhandle, through territory that had been saturated with the dead, with an injured leg and a silent teenager, and no communication equipment. "How did you, the dead?" "Gone," Eddie said. "Mostly. The ones that were left were walking south, and they didn't. They weren't interested in us. Like we weren't broadcasting the right frequency anymore." He paused, seemed to taste the irony of that. "I think that's literally what happened. The signal was coordinating them, and we weren't part of the signals, so we weren't part of the pattern. We were just noise, background. I opened the gate. They came through. I gave Eddie water first. He drank half a bottle in one continuous swallow, Adam's apple working. Water spilling down his chin into his beard. Then Cal, who drank carefully, rationing even now. I brought them inside, sat Eddie on the blockhouse steps, and looked at his leg. The makeshift bandage below his left knee was dark with dried blood and stiff with dust. Beneath it, a gash about 4 inches long, deep enough to show the pale layer of fat beneath the skin, but not deep enough for tendon or bone. Laceration, not a bite. He'd caught it on a piece of sheet metal climbing through a wrecked tractor trailer somewhere east of Groom. "Not infected," he said, reading my hesitation. "Check the edges. Clean cut, no bruising, no discoloration. I'm a doctor, Dale. Wrong species, but the pathology translates." I cleaned Eddie's wound with bottled water and the last of an iodine solution I'd found in the blockhouse first aid kit weeks earlier. He sat still for it, with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to treating patients who can't be told what's about to happen. Cal sat on the cot inside, silent, watching, the dead radio still in his lap. "Tell me about Shamrock," I said, taping a fresh bandage from the kit over the cleaned gash. Eddie told me. After our last conversation on the CB, the one that ended with his question about whether the gathering place's inhuman origin mattered if it offered genuine safety. The dead spot had closed completely. Total signal saturation on every band. He'd sat in the water treatment facility with Cal and listened to the signal evolve for 2 more days. Watched it develop increasingly specific and personalized messages. It had started speaking to him by name. It had used the voice of his ex-wife, a woman named Helen who lived in Houston, and who, as far as Eddie knew, might still be alive somewhere. The signal had constructed Helen's voice from fragments. Eddie had spoken her name during one of our CB conversations, and apparently that single utterance had been enough for the signal to cross-reference regional accent patterns and build an approximation. "It wasn't right," Eddie said. "It was close, but Helen has this thing she does when she's being persuasive. She drops into a lower register, almost a monotone, and the signal couldn't reproduce that. It got the pitch, but not the flatness. It sounded like Helen doing an impression of Helen." Cal had noticed first. That was the part Eddie kept returning to. The boy's perceptual acuity. His ability to hear the signal not as language, but as structure. "He said it sounded like a parrot," Eddie told me. "Same phrases, shuffled order, but no new material. He said it was repeating, not speaking. And once he said that, I couldn't unhear it." 3 days ago, Cal had turned the radio off, just reached over and pressed the button. The first volitional act Eddie had seen from the boy in nearly 2 weeks. And in the silence that followed, Cal had looked at Eddie and said, his first words in all that time, "I can hear you now." He'd been listening to the signal so intently that my actual voice couldn't reach him, Eddie said. I was sitting 3 feet away, talking to him every day, and the signal was louder, not in volume, in, I don't know, priority. It occupied the channel in his attention that was designed for human connection, and my physical voice couldn't compete. I thought about that for a long time. The signal hadn't needed to overpower human communication. It had needed to replace it, to fill the perceptual space that human beings reserve for meaningful sound, the channel we keep open for voices that matter. Once it occupied that channel, even a whisper from 3 feet away became inaudible. Not because it was quiet, but because it was the wrong signal in an already occupied band. This was what turning off the radio accomplished. Not protection from a threat. Clearance. It cleared the channel. It made room for the unmediated human voice, the one that traveled through air instead of wire, the one that required proximity, presence, physical coexistence in the same small room. Cal slept most of that first day. Eddie and I sat on the blockhouse roof in the weak afternoon sunlight. The storm front had stalled to the northwest, threatening but not delivering. And talked in the way that 2 people talk when they've been alone too long. Carefully at first, circling. Then with increasing velocity as the relief of being heard builds its own momentum, he asked what I'd done. I told him about the transmitter tubes shattering on the riverbed rocks, about dismantling the Harris Platinum Z with a socket wrench, about the decision not to broadcast my warning, the calculus of silence over speech. He listened without interrupting, which is a rare quality in anyone, and especially in someone whose profession requires issuing instructions to nervous ranchers holding down thrashing livestock. When I finished, he said, "You know they'll come anyway. People will still follow the signal. You didn't save everyone. I know. You might not have saved anyone. I know that too. Then why do it?" I didn't have a good answer. The honest one was something about complicity, about not wanting to be the signal's voice teacher, its accent coach, its unwitting collaborator in building a more convincing lure. But that was a negative reason. A reason defined by what I was refusing rather than what I was pursuing. The positive reason, the one I couldn't quite articulate, had something to do with Cal turning off the radio and hearing Eddie for the first time in 2 weeks. With the idea that silence is an emptiness, that silence is a cleared space where something human can reassemble. Eddie seemed to understand without requiring me to finish the thought. He had that quality, diagnostic intuition applied to people rather than animals, the ability to read what a body was trying to communicate before language caught up. Helen used to say I listened too hard, he said. That I was always trying to hear what people meant instead of what they said. Maybe that's why the signal couldn't fool me. I wasn't listening to the words. I was listening to the space between the words. And the space was wrong. Others came. Not many. Not a flood. A trickle. 1, 2 at a time, arriving over the course of the next 11 days, drawn not by a broadcast or a signal or a voice, but by the visible landmark of the KFAR-7 tower rising 300 feet above the flat panhandle. A structure you could see from 15 miles on a clear day, an artifact that said human beings built something here. Bill Keogh arrived on day 3, driving a battered Ford F-250 that coughed to a stop a quarter mile from the gate, with its fuel gauge needle buried below empty. He walked the remaining distance with his adult daughter Luann beside him, both of them carrying plastic grocery bags filled with canned goods and ammunition. Bill was 67, a cattle rancher from a spread north of Vega, skin like worked leather, hands that could have been carved from mesquite wood. He'd been running his operation alone since his wife died in 2022, and the outbreak had barely altered his daily routine for the first week. He lived so far from anyone that the collapse of civilization registered primarily as an interruption in his feed deliveries. Luann was 34, divorced, a former long-haul truck driver who'd moved back to the ranch after her marriage fell apart. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with her father's squint and a vocabulary of mechanical knowledge that rivaled my own in different domains. She could rebuild a diesel injector pump on a tailgate. She could back a 53-foot trailer into a space with 6 inches of clearance on each side. She had opinions about everything and expressed them at a volume calibrated for open pasture. And she was the first person since the outbreak started who made me laugh. "Your tower's the only thing taller than a fence post for 50 miles, she told me, unloading the grocery bags onto the blockhouse counter. Dad saw it from the ranch and said if anyone's alive, they're near the big stick. So here we are. They'd heard the signal. Everyone had. Bill had listened to it for a day and a half on his kitchen radio before unplugging it and going back to feeding his remaining cattle. Didn't sound right, was all he said about it. Sounded like a sales pitch. He paused, then added with the conversational timing of a man who spent decades talking mostly to animals. I don't buy from salesmen who call at 3 in the morning. What Bill and Luann brought, beyond food and the physical capability to work, was a piece of the future. Bill knew the land. He knew where water ran in wet years, where it could be dug for in dry ones, which pastures had shelter from the north wind, which roads stayed passable in mud. Luann knew machinery, logistics, the practical geometry of moving heavy things from one place to another. They weren't survivors in the reactive sense. They were people who knew how to sustain life in a hard landscape, and they'd been doing it long before the dead started walking. We became 5. Then on day 8, 6. A woman appeared on the access road at dusk, walking east, not from the direction of the gathering place, from the opposite direction, from the west, from New Mexico. She was small, dark-haired, wearing a state park's uniform so filthy that the patches were unreadable. Her name was Rosa Munoz, and she'd been a ranger at Ute Lake State Park near Tucumcari until the dead overran the campgrounds. She'd driven east until her vehicle died, then walked, following the interstate, sleeping in abandoned cars, eating whatever she found in gas station shelves. Rosa hadn't heard the signal. She had no radio. She'd lost hers in the first week, dropped it in Ute Lake while evacuating a campsite, and had been operating in pure analog since. Navigating by road signs, telling time by the sun, communicating with no one. She was the most disoriented person I'd met since the outbreak, because she had no framework for what had happened. No emergency broadcasts, no government updates, no context. Just the direct evidence of her senses. The dead walked. Civilization was gone, and she was alive. When I explained the signal to her, what it was, where it came from, what it did, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as baffled pity. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the dead learned to talk on the radio, and people followed them." "Yes. And you had to destroy your own equipment to stop helping them learn." "Yes." She looked at the disabled transmitter on the workbench, the empty antenna junction panel, the severed cables. Then she looked back at me. "I walked 400 miles without a radio, and I'm fine. Maybe the problem wasn't the dead. Maybe the problem was the radios." It was reductive. It was unfair to the millions who depended on emergency communication to survive the early days. But it had the particular sting of a truth delivered without diplomacy by someone who hadn't been marinating in the same information environment. Rosa had survived by being unreachable. The signal couldn't lure you if it couldn't reach you. The dead couldn't herd you if you weren't listening to the shepherd. The simplest survival strategy in a world where communication had been weaponized was the one nobody with a radio would have thought of. Don't have a radio. I want to tell you what the days were like, because the days are the part that matters now. We settled into a rhythm, the six of us, that had nothing to do with broadcast schedules or signal monitoring or electromagnetic theory. It was a rhythm dictated by the physical world. Dawn, water, food, work, weather, dark. Bill knew ranching. Luann knew machines. Rosa knew land management, soil, water tables, native plants, the ecology of the panhandle before anyone strung wire across it. Eddie knew bodies, animal and human. Cal, it turned out, knew fences. He'd worked summers on a ranch near Shamrock before the outbreak, and his hands remembered the specific choreography of stretching wire and driving staples that his mouth still rarely described. I knew infrastructure. I knew how to wire a solar panel to a battery bank, how to ground a lightning rod, how to run conduit and mount junction boxes and make electricity behave in predictable ways. So I did that. I rebuilt the blockhouse electrical system for habitation rather than broadcast. Lighting, ventilation, a jury-rigged water heater using a tankless unit Luann salvaged from an abandoned RV park outside Amarillo. Small work, human-scale work. The kind of engineering that serves 6 people in a concrete building instead of 250,000 anonymous receivers across the plains. There was something in the reduction that I hadn't expected. For 22 years, my work had been defined by reach. How far could the signal travel? How many people could it touch? How much territory could one relay station cover? Range was the measure of value. But here, in the blockhouse, the measure of value was proximity. Could you hand someone a cup of water? Could you hear them when they spoke? Could you see their face well enough to know if they were telling the truth? The storm that had been threatening finally arrived on the 3rd week. Not a single event, but a series. A late spring pattern of squall lines and thunderstorms rolling across the panhandle every 2 or 3 days. The rain was a gift. We rigged collection systems from the blockhouse gutters, filled every container we had, watched the dry land around the tower turn green with a speed that seemed almost aggressive. Bill said it was buffalo grass, dormant, waiting for moisture. "It's been here the whole time," he said. "Just needed the rain to show up." I didn't miss the metaphor. I don't think he intended one. Bill was not a metaphorical man, but the image stayed with me. Life present but invisible, waiting for the right conditions to become itself. On clear nights, I climbed the tower. Not all the way. My back and my history with falling off towers kept me to the first platform, about 80 feet up, but high enough to see the panhandle in its full scope. The land lay flat and dark in every direction, starlight catching on fence wire and the occasional glint of an abandoned vehicle on the interstate. To the south, toward the Wichitas, the horizon sometimes glowed faintly. Atmospheric scatter from something luminous, something I couldn't identify and didn't try to. The gathering place, doing whatever it did with the people it had collected. I thought about those people. Every time I climbed the tower, I thought about them. Christine, Teresa, the man with the dog, the woman with the stroller, the 47 voice signatures I'd mapped on the spectrum analyzer, each one representing a person who'd broadcast into the dark and been consumed. Were they alive? Were they something else? Had the gathering place delivered what the signal promised? Water, food, shelter, organization? Or had it delivered something I lacked the imagination to conceive? I didn't know. That was the thread I couldn't tie off. The open circuit that hummed in the background of every good day at the blockhouse. I'd chosen silence to protect people from the signal, but silence also meant I'd never know if the signal's promises had been true. It was possible, not likely, but possible, that the gathering place was exactly what it claimed to be. That the dead had organized, however incomprehensibly, into a system that actually sustained human life. That the people who'd followed the voice were safer than I was. And if that were true, then my grand act of principled destruction, shattering transmitter tubes on a riverbed, dismantling the infrastructure of connection, had been an act of sabotage against a rescue I was too suspicious to accept. I held that possibility without resolving it. Eddie said it was healthy. Rosa said it was pointless. Bill said nothing, which was his way of saying he had opinions that wouldn't help anyone. Luann said, if it was real, it didn't need to steal dead people's voices to say so. That was enough for me. Not certainty, not proof, just a principle I could stand on. Genuine safety doesn't need to lie about its source. Whatever the gathering place was, it had introduced itself through deception, and deception disqualified it from my trust, even if its outcomes were benign. You don't walk into a building because the door is beautiful. You walk in because you can see through the windows. The Yasu receiver stays in a drawer in the blockhouse, top shelf, behind a box of fuses and a roll of electrical tape. I see it every time I reach for a fuse, which is often. The jury-rigged electrical system has opinions about load balancing, and the fuses are my negotiation tool. I haven't turned it on. I know that I could. I know that the signal might have changed, evolved further, decayed, gone silent, or developed capabilities I can't predict from the safety of radio silence. Ignorance is not a strategy, Eddie reminds me periodically, with the tone of a man quoting something his veterinary school professor said. He's right. Strategically, monitoring the signal would provide useful intelligence about the state of the world beyond our small perimeter. But every time I reach for the Yasu, I think about Cal sitting by that window in Shamrock, unable to hear the living man 3 feet away, because the dead signal occupied his attention so completely. I think about how easily the channel fills, how quickly the voice that travels through wire replaces the voice that travels through air. And I leave the receiver in the drawer. Last week, Luann and I drove the F-250, resurrected with diesel siphoned from abandoned trucks along the interstate, to the outskirts of Amarillo for a supply run. The city was quiet. Not empty, but quiet. The dead that remained moved sluggishly, disorganized, individuals, rather than the coordinated columns I'd seen during the migration. Without the signal's direction, they'd reverted to their base behavior. Aimless, responsive to sound and movement, dangerous in close quarters, but manageable at distance. The signal had given them purpose, and without it, they were just the dead again. Terrible, yes, but comprehensible. We loaded the truck with canned goods, medical supplies, and 2 40-pound bags of dog food that Luann insisted on taking because we're going to find a dog eventually, and I refused to be unprepared. On the drive back, passing the empty relay tower at KFAR 7's eastern approach, she asked me a question. Do you regret it? The transmitters? I watched the towers slide past the window. 300 feet of steel lattice that I'd climbed dozens of times, maintained through ice storms and wind damage, kept operational through budget cuts and equipment failures. My tower, my station, my life's work, rendered mute by my own hands. No, I said. And then, because honesty requires more than a single syllable, but I think about it every day. I think about the people I might have reached with a warning. I think about the signal getting stronger from my warning. I think about both of those things simultaneously, and I can't make them resolve into a clean answer. That's not regret, Luann said. That's just being a person who did something that mattered. She was right. The absence of resolution wasn't the same as the presence of regret. I'd made a choice in conditions of radical uncertainty, using the best information available. And the choice had cost me something real. That was just the shape of a serious decision. Clean answers are for problems that aren't serious. We drove back to the blockhouse with a truckload of supplies and a future that extended, provisionally, a few more weeks. The panhandle spread around us in every direction, green from the rains, empty and vast, and ours in the way that unclaimed things become yours when you're the only one still tending them. And here is the thing I carry, the residue that sits beneath everything else. I was useful to the signal, my expertise, my authority, my voice. They were exactly what it needed to build its most convincing lure. Every broadcast I'd made in those first desperate days, when I'd believed I was saving lives, had been a lesson for something that was learning to mimic salvation. I was the textbook it studied, the accent it mastered, the credibility it wore. I don't carry this as guilt. Guilt implies I should have known, and I couldn't have. I carry it as something stranger, a vertigo, a disorientation. The sensation of having been fluent in a language that was being spoken back to me by something that had learned every word without understanding a single one. Like discovering that a conversation you thought was intimate was actually a recording session. Like finding out the mirror was a window. Marguerite's voice is in the signal somewhere, still. My voice is in there too. The spectral ghosts of emergency broadcast engineers and frightened civilians, and a woman in Tulsa who said, "God bless you," all woven together into a choir that sings without meaning what it sings. I built a shortwave antenna last month. Low power, directional, pointed northeast toward the parts of the country the signal might not have reached. Not to broadcast, not yet, maybe not ever. Just to listen when I'm ready for other silences. for the gaps in the spectrum that might mean someone else chose to go quiet, chose proximity over range, chose the voice that carries 40 feet over the voice that carries 400 miles. I haven't turned it on, but it's there, ready, waiting for the day I decide that the risk of hearing is worth the chance of being heard. Cal spoke a full sentence at dinner last night, unprompted, unsolicited. He looked up from his plate of Luann's dubious cornbread and said, "The fence on the north side needs 2 new posts before the next storm." 6 people at a table went quiet, not because the sentence was remarkable, but because the voice was. A teenage boy, re-entering the frequency of ordinary human communication, 1 sentence at a time. Eddie caught my eye. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The only signal that matters is the one that travels through air, between people who are close enough to see each other's faces, and arrives without being asked for. It isn't loud. It doesn't reach far. It doesn't carry the institutional weight of an emergency broadcast or the seductive authority of a system that has learned to sound like everything you've lost. But it is real. And in a world where the dead have learned to speak, real is the only frequency worth trusting. The tower still stands. 300 feet of steel above the panhandle, visible for miles, a landmark for anyone moving across the flats with eyes to see. We keep the aviation warning lights off. No power to spare for cosmetics, and besides, the lights once drew the dead like moths. Now the tower is just a structure, inert, purposeful, only as a waypoint for living eyes scanning a horizontal world for something vertical. I climbed to the first platform yesterday evening. Sunset on the panhandle, the whole sky lit from the west in shades of copper and rust, the land below shadowed and cooling. To the south, the faint glow on the horizon that I've never investigated and probably never will. To the north and west, nothing but grass and distance, and the thin, dark line of the interstate running east and west like a suture across the earth. Somewhere out there, radios are still on. The signal still speaks. Marguerite's voice still says, "Come," and mine still says it's safe. And the dead still walk their patient migration toward whatever waits in the mountains. But here, in the silence I chose, in the range of voices I can hear without a receiver. Bill calling the cattle he's begun to gather from the empty ranches. Luann arguing with a diesel engine. Rosa mapping water sources in a spiral notebook. Eddie teaching Cal the names of bones. Here the frequency is clear. I keep the Yasu in the drawer. I keep the shortwave antenna pointed northeast. I keep the memory of Marguerite separate from the thing that wears her voice. And I keep the knowledge of what I fed the signal in a place where I can look at it without flinching. I was the infrastructure. The signal used me as designed. But I am the one who chose to go quiet. And in the quiet, I found the only thing the signal could never replicate. Not because it lacked the technology, but because it lacked the proximity. The sound of someone you trust, breathing in the next room, alive and unbroadcast, and close enough to touch.